Well, I am going to just quickly introduce our next presenter, Dr. Nadia Bennett. Dr. Bennett is a visionary leader in education and the founder of When Brown Girls Lead, which is a consulting firm focused on fostering equity-driven schools nationwide. As a former charter superintendent and principal, she led transformative improvements, doubling ELA scores, revitalizing districts, and elevating schools to top rankings. Her passion for dismantling systemic barriers is rooted in her own academic journey, with degrees from Dillard and Howard University and training from the Urban Superintendent's Academy. Through consulting and coaching, Dr. Bennett empowers educators to create inclusive, anti-racist learning environments where all students can thrive. Welcome, Dr. Bennett.
Of course. Thank you, Kate, for such a lovely introduction. I am excited to be with you guys today. If you were here for my first session that I did, the topic that we're discussing today is the same, but we are diving into it differently. And we're also going to discuss some more actionable items in regards to instruction. So for the first part of this, well, actually, let me go through the agenda first. We're going to be talking about quantitative versus qualitative data and the importance of both, and the importance of the voices of leaders of color, as well as some strategies for supporting and retaining leaders of color. If you could take out your phones really quickly and go ahead and scan and complete a very, very quick survey. Okay, so we have several people that said they use both quantitative and qualitative data. Right behind that, quantitative only. I would love from someone then that said that they use both quantitative and qualitative. Would you mind sharing more about that?
I can share. Coming from my old program, we did empathy interviews with students, with their cooperating teachers. We did end of course surveys. We also did quarterly surveys where we asked the student and the cooperating teacher the same question to kind of compare perceptions and see, if they were on the same page, or if we knew, wow, you think it's going great and you think it's not. We need to have a meeting and just kind of try to connect. So we try to use mixed methods just about everywhere.
I absolutely love that. And unfortunately, your experience is not as common as it should be. So I would love for everyone, like in the chat really quickly, when you see that there's a good amount of whether school leaders or program leaders that are still only using quantitative data alone or using qualitative data alone and not using that mix of both, I wonder what questions come up for you. Any questions? What comes up for you? And I would love for you to place that in the chat. How are they addressing institutional biases and structural barriers? What part of the picture are they missing if not using both? I love that. Full picture. I wonder why leaders don't use qualitative data more. I agree. Absolutely. Allison is asking for examples of both. So quantitative data would be purely numbers based. So think of things such as what percentage of our teachers or mentors identify as people of color, right? That's purely a number. Versus qualitative data would be assessing the experiences of your educators of color by having conversations with them and understanding them. So words versus numbers. Is the data reliable or valid? Nakisha, could you come off of mute and talk to us about your question?
Yeah, I think if you over rely on one and not have like the balance of having them both, is it reliable? Is it valid? For instance, I think about like we are really great at gathering like data, surveys, using surveys to like gather data and then make decisions about our program based on the data. And I wonder if we just use some of the quantitative data and said, oh, well, 100 or 80% say they strongly agree that coursework is aligned with their experiences in schools. Okay, great. 80% sounds like a wonderful number. But what about the 20% there? How can we like go in and gather information and get more qualitative data to better understand why they experience what that gap is? So we have this data that looks good, but is it real? Like, are we really doing a good job? Because there's still a significant number of residents who don't see the coherence between our coursework and what they experience in the clinical setting.
I absolutely love that. Thank you. So we're going to watch a video. The danger of a single story. Some of you may have seen this video before. We're going to watch a clip of it, not the entire thing. And then we're going to have a chat about that. If you have seen it before, I want you to begin to prime your brains to think about it from the lens of the stories we tell ourselves or hear regarding educators of color specifically.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing? So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
On the next slide, I have a question regarding applying this understanding to the experience of educators of color specifically. But before we get into that, I would love for you guys to just share what came up for you when listening to this. It can apply to education, it could not. But I want to leave space for what comes up for you when you hear something like this. You can choose to come off of mute or you can put it in a chat.
Thank you, Nadia, for this video and just the question that you're posing here. I would say that one of the things that it made me think is just the single story that our media portrays of people of color in general, that they are violent, that, Black males are violent, that Black females are or can be overly aggressive, Latinos drink a lot and take siestas under the tree. I mean, there's tons of stereotypes that are really prevalent in our society, and that stems from the media that we receive and kind of the archetypes that we receive through popular media, and also right now on the political landscape and narratives that we're hearing around people of color. And so for me, that it really just brought up that idea of the single story just around communities of color in general, and then how does that influence um, how we interact and engage in our education systems with teachers of color.
Thank you, Heather, for sharing that. Some things that were put into the chat, that implicit bias may not be intentional, but is still harmful. Thinking of how history is written and how it can be viewed from various perspectives with widely different ideas. I want you to choose one of the quotes up here that all come from the video that we just listened to. And I want you to think about that from the lens of educators of color. How this danger of a single story may be applied to the experiences of educators of color. And you're going to put your response in the chat, and I do want everyone to respond. I have not started cold calling, but I should tell you guys I was once a teacher and I will still cold call. I'm very familiar with it. I will do it. I promise you. Kate's going to be like, Nadia, get out of here. But I'm going to do it anyway. So, so please, I want everyone, the more brains, the more thought partners, the more that we share, the more engaging and fruitful our learning can be. So we do want everyone engaged in this. So if you could choose a quote and put your response of how that applies to educators of color in the chat, that would be incredible. A patronizing, well-meaning pity lowers the opportunities for students, especially when they never had a real shot. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez, for dropping that in the chat. As it brings up for me that one of the biggest mistakes that educators make as it pertains to students of color is when we hear the challenges that they may have in the community or at home, we feel that the appropriate thing to do is to lower expectations for them because they've got it hard, and that's one of the worst things that you can do. We as human beings are wired for challenge. We grow through pain. The difficult things make us stronger and wiser, etc. I'm not saying to make it intentionally more difficult for anybody, but we should never lower our expectations because it's actually kind of disrespectful, to be honest with you, to lower your expectations for someone and expect that because people rise to the level of expectation that you have for them. So if you don't think much of them, it's disrespectful, whether unintentional or not. How and when stories are told is dependent on power. Without having educators of color in positions of leadership and power, stories will likely be a single story. And that is from Jessica. Jessica, would you mind coming off of mute and telling us more about that?
Well, I was just thinking about, in some districts that I work with, that there's a lack of leadership of teachers of color or educators of color. And so I wonder how that impacts our students, but also how it impacts our teachers, because when, we've had teachers of color leave our districts for feeling othered or feeling not like they're belonging. And so I just think about the impact that's making in the stories that we're hearing, and then thinking about some of those biases that were brought up earlier about, people already making so many assumptions about what they don't know.
and making assumptions about their intellectual ability, right? That is something that as a Black woman that I have constantly had to overcome in my career, and that people assume what you're capable of intellectually. That is until I open my mouth, obviously. But when I walk into a room, people assume what my intellectual abilities just because I'm Black. And it's a constant thing that I have to overcome. So what we want to do is we want to begin to familiarize ourselves with more qualitative data, specifically the stories of educators of color, to better understand their experiences and mentally marry those to the quantitative data that many of us are already familiar with, right? We know that we need more educators of color in the classroom. We know we need more leaders of color, et cetera. But if we don't understand the why behind that, we don't have an entry point for a solution, okay? So in a moment, you're gonna go into breakout rooms. When you get into breakout rooms, the very first thing you're gonna do is everyone's gonna independently read the stories of Diane, Atik, and Leslie. It is in the document that you received today. The links for those stories are in the documents. Gonna read those independently, and I really want you guys to hold yourselves accountable to that. Then when you come back from that group, the first thing you are going to discuss is, did reading the stories of those educators bring up any feelings of discomfort for you? And if so, why? Okay. And then the second question, how do the stories of these leaders of color bring light to the challenges of retaining leaders of color? You're going to have 15 minutes to do that. And I'm going to be popping into the groups to hear from you and to understand you so I can bring the knowledge back to the group as well. Jumping into breakout rooms, I want to first acknowledge all of the individuals that readily said, I understand these stories. I've been that person, right? Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for bringing that to this space, because your story matters. It matters a lot. And the more we hear that, the better off we'll be as far as educators. I would love to hear what your groups discussed in regards to how these stories bring to light the challenges that one experiences when working to retain leaders of color.
I think from one of the components that we talked about, typically teachers have different roles that they're playing, right? There's all these different hats that the teacher has to wear throughout the year. But with leadership, there's also different hats that they have to wear as well. And I think one of them that maybe is under recognized is the hat of being an advocate. So why isn't somebody advocating for Diane not to be just looked at as the disciplinarian? Like, is it because she's more engaging? Is she a more creative teacher? Why can't she be the creative teacher? Why does she have to be the disciplined teacher? Likewise, in the second vignette, like, why isn't there somebody advocating for this teacher as well and kind of letting them hang out there with, catching all of that heat? And so I think that's scary, because if you're being recruited to mentor, you're being recruited based off the strength of the teaching. Now this idea that, like, oh wait, I should also be advocating for this other person. That's a skill even that you have to pick up, or even some training that you probably require.
It's a great perspective.
Can I add on to what Dr. Gonzalez just mentioned?
Absolutely.
What it brought up for me is that because the system itself kind of, I forgot the gentleman that opened up your presentation, Dr. Gonzalez, but he was talking about basically that white supremacy is embedded in our school institutions, right? And so the idea that educators of color by default need an advocate. And oftentimes that advocacy would, the natural place that advocacy would fall would be on the mentor teacher, but kind of this idea of starting with that default. Like if you're a mentor teacher, part of your role, especially for educators of color, is that advocacy piece. And I would argue for, any of our residents, because it is hard to be a resident. But if you're really focusing on residency programs as a way to diversify the workforce, it seems like that, I don't know, that really for me just underscores the point that, yeah, advocacy needs to be a part of the mentor relationship. It needs to be called out as such.
If you identify as a person of color and you were once a teacher, how does it land on you to hear teachers of color need advocates? How does that land on you? Keisha, you gonna make me cold call on you?
I'm
Because
listen, I'm trying to hold it. Like
I saw your facial expression. And I was like, if she don't take herself off of mute, I'm gonna have to go into auntie mode and cold call. You
I
make me
appreciate
do it. Okay, go ahead.
I appreciate that because I'm really trying to, I don't know, percolate on how that makes me feel. I think in one respect, I don't feel like I need an advocate as my very first year teaching, I was sharing with the group. I was the only Black teacher that my students had, and I worked in the community in Baton Rouge, which I know because you was in Louisiana. But I worked in the school that was predominantly Black students, and I was the only Black teacher on the hallway, and so I wore many hats, and among those hats was the disciplinarian. Did I need somebody to advocate for me? No, because I got it. I mean, that's just, the burden that Black women bear. Like, I got it. Could I have used one? Probably. I think, especially for the white women who were on the hallways with me, I wish that they had I don't know, the lens then to be able to advocate for me, to say, like, no, she doesn't deserve to be the go-to person. She also deserves people to come into her classroom to coach her up, and not come into the classroom to drop a student off because they're going to do what they're supposed to do in her class. And so I think, in a way, yeah, the answer to that's why I was like silent, because I was trying to process what my response was to it. But I feel it on both sides. Could I have used an advocate? For sure. Did I need one? No.
Can I add to that? And I'm gonna guess, Nakisha, I'm probably got about 20 years on you experience. So I'm gonna say absolutely, we got it. We can do it. I don't need anybody. I can, but that's what leads to burnout. And so the could have had it part, or would have been nice to have someone tap you on the shoulder or tell you about an opening that you might not have known about because you have somebody looking out for you, is something that I feel like we do need when there's not those of us out, or those of us who are, let's see, really looking out for the best interests of all of us. I'll leave that there. We do need to know about the things that are going on, and to have someone making the extra effort to at least make the opportunity where I'm gonna get the job myself, but if I don't know about it, I can't apply for it. So that's the tap on the shoulder part. I was part of my dissertation in looking at what advocacy we need, and it's like we need it from our peers, we need it from our mentors, and we need it from our leaders. And when we don't have those three things, that's what burns us out, and we fry because we're doing all the things for all the people all by ourselves, where our white peers are not asked to do that same thing, or don't feel the internal need to do that same thing. And so we're paying that whole Black teacher tax that our white counterparts don't have to, especially in the environments like where we know stuff, we get stuff, we live there, we understand, while we're also studying and writing and doing all the things. So I think maybe it's the word like need, or we have to have, is no, I don't need nothing. I got it myself. However, I know that to be tapped and told, hey, apply for this. This opportunities here, I think you'd be great, or that encouragement versus, other people just letting it go. They're good where they are, so let's keep them where they are because we need them. We couldn't replace that person if they left. So let's make sure they stay and handle all the things we don't know how to handle. Anyway, just sharing some research.
And I'm gonna Edward, I see your hand, and I got you in just a second. I'm going to build on what both of you said, and be a woman enough to say I do need it. It's okay for me. I did need it, I should say, when I was in my 20s and teaching, and in my 20s and becoming an assistant principal, etc. Here's why I say that. When I became a principal is when you get your eyes on the budget, right? And I got to see the disparity between what white women were earning versus Black women were earning. And what I learned as a principal is that the white women were the ones that were encouraged and to negotiate higher salaries. Every single year when it was time to renew those contracts, my white female teachers, white woman teachers, pardon me, they knew how to look me in the eye and negotiate a higher salary. Somebody taught them how to do that. We are all familiar with what we call the old boys club that white men have, right? Where they are constantly stretching out their hand to one another and bringing one another up and helping one another with promotions, etc. The reason I will be woman enough and vulnerable enough to say that I need it is because everybody else has it. And our road and the road for women of color coming up behind us now is much more difficult because we do not have it. Right? And that's the story of many educators of color. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Edward, what did you want to bring to the table?
No, I wanted to say because my mom's a teacher and she didn't need it. She was strong. And so where I like to think I'm strong, I definitely needed it. Like I couldn't. I needed people to advocate for me, and for me it wasn't even until like 5, 6 years later that I even realized they were advocating for me back then. So it's almost like I felt like I owed those people. And it was just sometimes it was just somebody to help grease the wheel, like, hey, Gonzalez, that don't worry about that. That's not how it works. Like we can do something different. And that would go a long way.
I agree. So I allowed us space to have an in-depth conversation about our experiences because our experiences is qualitative data. Understanding the experiences of educators of color is a part of the solution to the challenges that we had. So one thing that I heard Jessica mention in the breakout group is that she has observed some of these stories, she has seen it herself, but she doesn't know what the solution is. These conversations that we're having right now gives us an entry point to the solution. Right, if you're only looking at the fact that, like right now, my dissertation research was on Black woman superintendents. Just 2% or less than 2% of superintendents nationally identify as Black women. If I only looked at that number, I could come up with a whole host of single stories as to why that exists. But I made a different choice and I did qualitative research and talked to Black woman superintendents who understand their stories that I'm able to deliver on. Here's what they are experiencing. Here's what's keeping them away from the position. Here are the systemic barriers, et cetera, et cetera. And then once we understand that, a board, a school district, et cetera, can choose to make different decisions based upon that. We need both pieces of data, quantitative and qualitative. We need to understand the stories of people of color. Then once we have that, it's our job to retain them, right? So this is a book, if you were in the last session, that I recommended that people look into. In said book, you'll find the stories that you just read were individuals that are listed in this book. But then also they provide 6 principles for supporting and retaining leaders of color, educators of colors, pardon me. And so they're going to dive into 2 aspects of that. That's cultivating and reflecting on awareness, and then also instructional practices. So I want everyone to independently read the information on the slide. And then when you're done, in the chat, you're going to enter your thoughts, questions, or epiphanies, TQEs. Thoughts, questions, or epiphanies based upon this principle of supporting and retaining leaders of color. I feel like the partner, sibling, best friend comment sets up the framework for seeking absolution from misunderstanding to microaggression. Best, are you able to come off of mute and tell us more about that? Oh, there you are.
Yes, for that, I feel like it almost serves as an apologist for the person saying it. It's kind of like, but I'm not these things. It's everyone else. I understand. But I'm like, I some of my half sisters are biracial, and the fact that their moms were in a relationship with our dad, it didn't mean that they understood Black community and Black culture. They just liked our dad, right? So it's like I commit to this one person, but they didn't they didn't go to museums, they didn't read books, they didn't try to teach their biracial child what it means to be Black in America. They had to address it once their biracial child experienced racism or microaggressions, but they didn't go in laying the foundation. So that's part of that for me.
Pardon me. You mentioned something that's really key, and that I am glad that you gave a segue for me to mention. They did not read books or be intentional about understanding, right? So a lot of the work I do is around anti-racism, equity, et cetera. And I'm constantly asked by people, how do I fix this? What do I do? The answer is always, you start with yourself. You have to start by understanding a couple of things. Number one, if you were born, raised, socialized in this country, you have biases against people of color, period. Why do you have that? Because that's what the media taught us. That's what schooling taught us. That's what religious institutions taught us, et cetera. The very first thing you have to do is come to a place of acceptance to understand that you didn't create it, but you were born into it. And every single one of us have biases. You can't go out and change a program culture or a school culture for a person of color if you don't first change yourself. It is the number one requirement. After that, then you can move into spaces of how do I create this change across the building? Someone mentioned oppression is not unilateral. Being in a very rural Northern California community, overlapping systems do reproduce multiple types of inequality. Allison, talk to us a little bit more about that.
I was just thinking that the lack of representation in leadership roles across the community, from city councils, county seats, it just continues to reinforce implicit bias and leads to more oppression. So our children aren't seeing people of color in any leadership roles, even in their schools and beyond their schools. So bringing that to our residency, bringing it to our mentors is important.
Tell us why that's important, Allison. I want to stay there for a second. Why is that important?
I think that our students need to be able to see that people who look like them and understand them that they need to be able to see that they can rise to those leadership roles too. And so our mentors need to know that they need to help our teacher residents continue to expose our children to because leaders that are of color throughout literature and books and guest speakers that they might not normally be seeing, because we're a very rural, very underrepresented community.
Once you tackle the awareness that biases exist, you then have to begin to not only create diverse spaces, which is what Allison is speaking to, but then you have to figure out, how do I retain that, maintain and retain that diversity? So one of the research-based reasons that people of color either are not able to attain these positions or do not stay in these positions is because there's no high quality instructional support. There are a lack of mentors and clinical experiences, and just a general dissatisfaction with how they're developing as teachers, right? So very naturally, your program is a part of changing that, in that they're offered mentorship, et cetera. But then how are you being consistent with those instructional supports, and what do they look like from day to day, right? So you know how you can say something and people can have two different definitions of those things in their mind? Like right now, if I were to ask, what does high impact instructional support look like? Everybody on this call would give me a different response because they have a different definition. Not to say that anybody's necessarily wrong, but there's not a common definition for what certain things look like, right? So imagine being in a, when you're thinking, let's back up, when you're thinking about potential solutions, yes, it starts with diversity and an intentionality around recruiting people of color for representation purposes and creating a space where students see people that look like them. And then it's an understanding of their story, right? Understanding who they are, authentically understanding who they are. We're not trying to save them. We're not being, how can I say, well, saviorism is just unacceptable, right? But you have to position yourself to truly be invested in understanding this person's experiences. And then how do you make them want to stay in their job? People don't want to stay where they're not growing. And if they're overlooked because they're managing classrooms well, as we just read, and they're not being allowed to learn what it means to have good instructional practices, then that person's not going to stay very long. So when we're talking about solutions, these are the type of things that we're talking about. So when thinking about what I just mentioned and the 4 tenets that are listed here, I want you to, again, put your thoughts, questions, and epiphanies in the chat, specifically your questions, because this is a space for your learning. So if you have any questions in regards to these, please drop them in the chat, and then we're going to have a quick conversation about those before I close out. Nakisha, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what you were just saying, Maria. Like, I also think frequency, as you shared, Dr. Bennett, has a lot to do with it. I imagine it feels much more less high stakes once like those sorts of like observations or those coaching instructional touch points happen more often. It feels less evaluative versus like supportive and like building you toward mastery. So having it more frequently with those same group of people in the room again can alter, like if you have it once a quarter or every now and then I would imagine that for the residents it feels like anxiety producing, like, oh my God, this is the evaluation, versus it again feeling like a support to help build toward mastery.
There's more to say in regards to specific instructional practices, but I'm at time and I want to be respectful. I want to dive a bit deeper. I'm going to come to the comments in a moment, but I want to dive a bit deeper into the instructional practices because, question, how many of the leaders on the call, mentors on the call, et cetera, program leaders on the call are using a cycle of observing a teacher, mentor, teacher, resident, et cetera, debriefing the observation, their glows and their grows, going back in to observe it again, having them practice a new skill? How many people are consistently having newer teachers practice a skill and then transferring that back into the classroom? Whether it's that exact cycle or not, do you use some kind of cycle to that effect consistently? Were you agreeing that that's a cycle that's consistently used?
It will be.
Okay.
Our residents start in August. So yes.
Okay. Have you experienced that cycle yourself?
See, that's what I wanted to talk about, but I also was being cautious of the time. But so you mean my experience becoming an educator? I have to remind myself not to default to how I was trained, like just because I survived, and it may not be, the best way. So I have to, I guess, remember that wellness, the well-being, and the balance, so that I won't repeat that same burnout structure or the cycle. But anyway, so my journey, I don't think I got that. Or I don't remember that, but I do see the benefit of it for our residency program.
Beautiful.
Yes.
The reason I say that is because the majority of educators are still not using a cycle like that. A lot of educators still consider teacher coaching to be going in for a walkthrough and giving them feedback. And that's happening infrequently. And that's not coaching. That's not supporting a person to be the greatest version of themselves in the classroom. It's important to make that distinction because a high level, high impact instructional support is a full cycle that's frequent, as was mentioned by Nakisha, and the person is heard and have a clear understanding of how they're growing instructionally. If there are questions, we can definitely. All right, so Jessica, you said that you use a similar cycle 6 times a semester. Beautiful. Essential depth, honesty, strategies offered, etc. Okay, I'm going to pause now, Kate. I just want to make sure that I highlighted the difference between giving a teacher feedback versus bringing them through a growth cycle.
One of the things I would add on that is that as directors or coordinators, we do that cycle, and I think we try, as hard as we can to make sure that the residents are having a lot of input into their growth and getting them to really reflect deeply about their practice. But I wonder if our mentors are able to do that. Mostly I feel like time is a huge barrier, and they're more quick to, we've talked with our training, a lot of our mentors about like the difference between giving facilitative versus directive feedback, and using some of the coaching tools from Elena Aguilar, I think have helped. And they seem on board when we go over this with them. However, in practice, I feel like it's a lot more like directive, like try this next time, versus getting the residents to really think about and reflect. So that's something I know we're still working on with our mentors. But I think that also comes from them as well, as what type of coach do they want to be. And to be fair, some of them have had no experience being coaching, so, and doing any coaching. So this is the first time in. And so they're still, being able to explore that role. So I value the time we get with them to try to develop them as coaches. But it's still a process.
That's actually exactly why I asked the question earlier of, were you trained in that manner? Because it is definitely more difficult to help someone grow and utilize that cycle if you yourself have not experienced it, and nor have you ever seen it, right? So the training that you give the mentors is actually key, because they need to be prepped to be effective facilitators as well. So I'm in agreement with you on that. And I see Nakisha and Carol all nodding their heads as well with that.
Being a part of this conversation that felt like very authentic. It felt like people were able to like speak their truths respectfully in both conversations. So thank you both. This is my first experience with the residency lab. And so thank you guys for allowing me this opportunity to connect and network with these people and hear from these two great leaders.
Of course. Well, welcome to the residency lab space. We're glad you're here. The way that we cultivate these sessions is really from hearing from all of you and like what you need, what you value. And so we use the feedback to help drive what we offer at the lab. And so we would really value any feedback that you have on today, or if you have attended previous sessions and didn't fill out a feedback form. So if you would just take a minute and fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. And I'm just going to pause and give you space to do that right now before we wrap up. So I'm going to pass it to Dr. Heather Michelle, our program's director, to close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Kate, for that introduction. Again, I just want to express my gratitude for the presenters and the space they created for our participants to really be open and authentic and really kind of grapple and process some of these hard concepts and ideas. I want to congratulate all of you that stayed on here for the call and really got to benefit from the richness of the discussion. So thank you for that. We do want to end by just informing you of a couple of upcoming lab events. We have the last deep dive session happening April 28th, right before the symposium on May 1st and 2nd. So it'll be a way for us to kick off that celebration and keep all the good energy moving. The next slide is about exactly that, our annual statewide residency symposium happening May 1st and 2nd. I really want to encourage you, if you are a newer residency program, to take advantage of attending this conference. It's one thing to be managing a residency program in your small context, in your place, in your site, here in California, but being in space with other residency practitioners, being able to get the expertise and insight and experiences from all the residency programs across California really makes a difference. And you begin to understand that residency isn't just happening in your small piece of the world. It's actually a movement that's happening across California. And so we really want you to be a part of that. And we really encourage you to come. The residency lab team will be there in full force. And so will our accompanying colleagues at the SRTAC team as well. And we hope you make the time to come. And we'll have Edward Gonzalez will be there to be presenting. I'll be presenting a couple sessions. And so the conversation will continue. Thank you so much. Any questions or comments, please email us at the Residency Lab. Thank you again so much for being here and giving us your time today. Appreciate you.